I had been ignoring the phone for hours when I finally turned it over and looked at the screen. 52 missed calls. All from the same number. Home. For a long time I just stared at it, sitting on the narrow metal bunk in my barracks room. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun hung low over the base painting, everything in that quiet golden color that always reminded me of fall back home in Ohio. 52 missed calls. From the same parents who had once left a note on the fridge telling me I was no longer welcome in their home. Funny how life works sometimes. I leaned back against the cold wall and let out a slow breath. My fingers traced the edge of my phone, but I didn't call them back. Not yet. Instead, my mind drifted back to the moment everything changed. The note. The kitchen. The refrigerator. And the 2 words I wrote that night before I walked out the door. The house smelled like coffee when I walked in that evening. The same smell that had filled that kitchen every morning of my childhood. Our house sat on the edge of a small town outside Dayton, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a modest 2-story place with white siding that had needed repainting for at least 10 years. My dad used to say he'd get around to it one of these summers. But summers kept passing. When I pushed the front door open that evening, the house felt unusually quiet. My duffel bag slid off my shoulder and hit the floor with a soft thud. Mom, I called. No answer. Dad. Still nothing. The kitchen light was on. I walked in slowly, my boots heavy against the old linoleum floor. And that's when I saw it. A piece of yellow legal paper taped to the refrigerator door. At first I thought it might be a grocery list. My mom wrote everything on those yellow pads she bought in stacks from Walmart. But the handwriting was my father's. Blocky, hard, pressed deep into the paper like he was carving the words instead of writing them. I stepped closer. And read the note. You're a disgrace to this family, pack and don't come back. The room suddenly felt smaller. For a few seconds I just stood there staring at the words. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind the paper. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could keep moving like nothing happened while something inside you cracked wide open. I had just come home from Marine Corps boot camp. 13 weeks, San Diego. 3 months that had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. Before I left, I'd been a 22-year-old girl from a quiet Ohio town who had never slept anywhere except my childhood bedroom. Now I was a United States Marine. And the first thing waiting for me at home was a note telling me I didn't belong there anymore. I pulled the paper off the refrigerator. My father had signed nothing. He didn't need to. I knew that handwriting better than my own. Growing up, my dad believed in 3 things more than anything else. Hard work, respect, and reputation. He had worked 35 years at the same auto parts factory before it shut down. A man who woke up at 5 every morning whether he needed to or not. But he also believed there were certain things daughters weren't supposed to do. Joining the Marines was one of them. When I told him I had enlisted, he looked at me like I'd just set the house on fire. Women don't belong in the Marines, he said that night at the dinner table. I already signed the papers, I told him. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. You did what? Mom cried. Dad didn't say another word for the rest of dinner. And when the day came for me to leave for boot camp, he never came to the bus station. Mom hugged me tight and whispered, your father just needs time. I guess time hadn't helped. Because now I stood alone in that same kitchen staring at the proof of it. I read the note again. You're a disgrace to this family, pack and don't come back. The words should have made me angry. But strangely they didn't. Boot camp had a way of burning anger out of you. After 13 weeks of drill instructors yelling in your face at 4 in the morning, a piece of paper didn't feel all that powerful anymore. I grabbed a pen from the counter. For a moment I thought about tearing the note in half. Throwing it away. Pretending I never saw it. But something inside me told me not to. Instead, I flipped the paper over. The back was blank. I stared at it for a long time. 2 words. That's all I wrote. 2 simple words. I pressed the pen down slowly and carefully, making sure the letters were clear. Then I taped the paper back to the fridge, exactly where it had been before. I picked up my duffel bag. The house was still quiet. Mom and Dad weren't home yet. Maybe they had gone out to avoid seeing me. Maybe they thought the note would do the talking for them. I paused at the door and looked back at the kitchen one last time. The table where we had eaten thousands of meals. The old coffee maker that rattled every morning. The refrigerator with the note still hanging there. For a second, I wondered if I would ever see that kitchen again. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The evening air was cool. The sun was setting behind the trees across the street. And just like that, I walked away from the only home I had ever known. Months later, the phone started ringing. At first, it was just once or twice. Then more often. Eventually, it became dozens of calls. And now, sitting in my barracks room, staring at the screen that read 52 missed calls, I finally understood something. The 2 words I had written that night had meant far more than my parents ever expected. I set the phone down beside me. Outside, the base loudspeaker crackled with evening announcements. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think about home. About the fridge. About that note. And about the moment my parents finally read what I had written on the back. Because when they saw those 2 words, everything began to change. When I was little, people in our town used to say my parents were good, solid folks. And in many ways they were. My father, Richard Carter, believed a person should show up on time, pay cash, when they could keep their grass cut and never complain in public. My mother, Linda, ironed pillowcases, sent thank you cards, and treated church potlucks like they were a matter of national duty. We were the kind of family that sat in the same pew every Sunday, waved at the same neighbors, and bought our back-to-school shoes at JCPenney when the sales started in August. From the outside, we looked steady. Respectable. The kind of family older people in town pointed to when they talked about how things used to be. But inside that house there were rules you didn't question. Some were spoken. Some were not. The spoken ones were simple enough. Don't slam doors. Don't use the Lord's name in vain. Don't talk back. Don't leave lights on in empty rooms. My father had a saying for every offense. Money doesn't grow on trees. This house isn't a hotel. Children are seen and not heard. He said those things so often they started to sound less like sentences and more like weather. The unspoken rules were the ones that mattered most. Men worked with their hands and carried the authority. Women kept the peace. Girls grew up, found decent husbands, and stayed close to home. And whatever happened inside the family stayed inside the family. I learned that last one early. When I was 8 years old, I fell out of the sycamore tree in our backyard and split my lip on a root. There was blood all over my shirt, and I remember crying harder from the shock than the pain. My mother rushed me into the bathroom with a wet washcloth while my father stood in the doorway shaking his head. "You were climbing like a boy," he said. I still remember the sting of peroxide on my lip and the deeper sting of those words. Not because they were cruel by the standards of that time and place, but because they told me something important. There were lines, and I was already stepping over them. As I got older, the gap between who I was and who my parents wanted me to be only widened. Other girls in school talked about homecoming dresses and future weddings and what colors they might paint their first kitchens someday. I nodded along because that was what girls were expected to do where I came from, but none of it stirred anything in me. What stirred something in me was discipline, purpose, service. I liked structure. I liked challenge. I liked the feeling that something bigger than comfort might be worth giving your life to. I didn't have words for that when I was young. I just knew I felt restless. That restlessness sharpened on September 11th, 2001. I was still a girl then, young enough that the adults tried to shield me from the worst of what happened, but old enough to understand that the world had changed on live television. I remember the image of smoke, the stunned voices of the reporters, my mother with one hand over her mouth, my father standing very still as if the only way to hold himself together was not to move at all. And I remember something else. The uniforms. Police, firefighters, Marines, sailors, soldiers, men and women running toward the kind of danger everybody else was desperate to escape. I watched those images again and again over the next weeks. To a lot of people, maybe it was fear that stayed with them most. For me, it was clarity. I wanted to be the kind of person who ran toward the hard thing. I never said that out loud at first. Not in our house. You learned quickly what could be spoken safely and what could not. My mother would have called it a phase. My father would have called it foolishness. So I kept the dream tucked away like contraband. I focused on school, worked part-time at a grocery store, helped my mother with casseroles for church families when somebody got sick or had a new baby. On paper, I looked like the daughter they had hoped for. But under the surface, I was waiting. When I was 17, my father found a Marine Corps brochure folded in the back pocket of my jeans while doing laundry. To this day, I do not know why he was the one doing laundry that day. My mother usually handled all of that. Maybe she was at her sister's. Maybe he was looking for something else. Maybe the Lord just decided the secret had waited long enough. He held the brochure up between two fingers at dinner like it was evidence in a trial. "What's this?" My stomach dropped. My mother looked from him to me and then back again. I tried to keep my voice even. "It's a brochure." "I can see that," he said. "What I'm asking is why my daughter has one." The room got quiet. Our kitchen was never really silent. The refrigerator hummed, the wall clock clicked, and the old baseboard heater sometimes knocked in the winter. But that night the silence felt crowded, like all the things nobody wanted to say had suddenly pulled up chairs. "I was just curious," I said. My father laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Curious. My mother set her fork down carefully. "Emily, sweetheart, girls can do all kinds of good things without—" She glanced at the brochure. "Without going into something like that. Something like what I asked." "Combat," my father said flatly. "Chaos, dirt, orders, men barking in your face. You want a life full of that." I wanted to say better that than a life where I have to ask permission to become myself. Instead I said women serve. "Not my daughter." The force in his voice landed like a slammed door. That was the first time he said it. "Not my daughter." He said it again over the next few years in different ways with different subjects. Not my daughter working nights. Not my daughter moving out alone. Not my daughter wasting money on some apartment. Not my daughter joining the military. Each sentence sounded like protection when he said it, but to me it felt more and more like possession. My mother softened the edges whenever she could. That was her role in the family. She'd bring me tea after an argument and sit on the edge of my bed smoothing invisible wrinkles from the blanket. "You know how he is," she would say. I hated that phrase by the time I turned 20. Because I did know how he was. The problem was nobody seemed to care how I was. I worked through community college for a while, took classes that interested me but led nowhere I could feel in my bones. I dated a boy named Travis for 6 months because he was polite and local and approved of by my parents, which turned out to be the surest sign he wasn't right for me. He wanted a simple life. There is nothing wrong with a simple life. A lot of good people live one. But he wanted me to want that life in exactly the same shape he did, and I couldn't force it. The older I got, the smaller my hometown felt. Not because it was bad. Because it no longer fit. I used to drive out past the soybean fields in the evening with the windows down listening to classic country on the radio and trying to imagine my life 10 years ahead. Every version where I stayed to keep my parents comfortable looked dimmer than the one where I left and disappointed them. That told me something I could no longer ignore. At 21, I drove to the recruiting office in a strip mall between a tax service and a nail salon. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could make myself open the car door. My palms were sweating, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Not because I was afraid of the Marines. Because I knew that once I stepped inside the life my parents had planned for me would begin to slip out of their hands. The recruiter was a gunnery sergeant with tired eyes and a patient voice. He didn't sell me a fantasy. He didn't promise glory. He asked direct questions and waited for honest answers. "Why the Marines?" I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. "Because I want to earn something no one can hand me." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. That was the beginning. Not the note on the fridge. Not the missed calls. Not even boot camp. The beginning was a young woman in a small Ohio strip mall finally choosing her own future, even though she knew the people who raised her might never forgive her for it. And maybe deep down I knew something else too. That one day they would have to face the daughter they tried so hard not to see. The first thing they took from me at boot camp was time. Not literally, of course. The clocks were still there. The sun still rose over San Diego every morning whether we were ready for it or not. But from the moment those yellow footprints came into view, time stopped belonging to me. It belonged to the Corps. It belonged to the drill instructors. It belonged to the schedule, the formation, the next shouted order, the next impossible expectation. I had thought I understood hard work before boot camp. I had grown up with a father who measured people by how early they got up and how little they complained. I had worked double shifts at the grocery store during holidays. I had hauled feed bags on my uncle's property one summer just to prove I could. None of that prepared me for Marine Corps boot camp. The bus ride from the airport had been quiet in that unnatural way people get quiet when fear has moved in and unpacked its bags. Every woman on that bus was trying not to look nervous. We sat stiff, staring ahead, each pretending she knew exactly what she had signed up for. Then the bus doors opened, and the yelling started. Not angry yelling, not exactly. More like a storm with a human voice. Orders came at us before our feet even hit the pavement. Move, stand here, face forward, faster, louder, wrong, fix it, again. The world narrowed fast. There was no Emily from Ohio anymore. No daughter, no church pew, no family arguments, no safe little bedroom with the pale blue curtains my mother had sewn when I was 12. There was only this moment, this demand, this breath, this mistake, this correction. I remember lying awake that first night, exhausted beyond reason, staring up at the rack above me and thinking, "You have made the biggest mistake of your life." Then morning came at what felt like the middle of the night, and I was too busy surviving to think that thought again. The days settled into a pattern that didn't feel like a pattern at the time because it was all so relentless. Revel before dawn. Making the rack so tightly and neatly that one wrinkle felt like a moral failure. Moving everywhere fast. Learning when to speak, how to stand, how to hold yourself, how to become part of a unit without disappearing inside it. I had never been around women from so many different places before. New York, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan. Women with sharp city voices and women with soft country accents. Women who had grown up poor, women who had gone to college. Women escaping bad homes, women following family tradition, women trying to outrun grief, boredom, or themselves. At first, we were just strangers under pressure. Then pressure did what pressure often does. It showed us who we were. One recruit cried silently every night for the first 2 weeks, and still outperformed half the platoon on the obstacle course. Another talked tough and acted fearless until the first rifle qualification week broke her confidence clean in half. A quiet woman from Tennessee, old soul in a young face, became the person everybody trusted when things got bad. You learned quickly not to judge people by the wrong moments. That included yourself. I made mistakes, plenty of them. I moved too slowly. I answered too softly. I got corrected for the angle of my chin, the speed of my pivot, the way I folded my gear, the way I breathed too visibly after a run. There were mornings when my muscles hurt so badly I had to talk myself through the simple act of standing up. There were nights when I missed home so sharply it felt like physical pain. And to my own surprise, there were moments when I missed my parents. Not the conflict, not my father's control, but the ordinary things. My mother rinsing coffee mugs at the sink. My father clearing his throat over the newspaper. The smell of bacon on a Saturday morning. Memory is funny that way. It softens details you swore would stay sharp forever and sharpens things you thought you barely noticed at all. But boot camp did not allow much time for nostalgia. It demanded presence, absolute unforgiving presence. One foot in front of the other. One task then the next. One correction then improvement. At the rifle range, something in me settled. I had always been steady with my hands. Patient. Focused. While others fought nerves, I found calm in the repetition of breathing, aiming, adjusting. It wasn't about aggression. That's something people who have never served often get wrong. The Marines did not teach chaos. They taught control, responsibility, precision under pressure. And I responded to that. For the first time in my life, I was in a place where no one cared whether I fit their idea of what a daughter should be. They cared whether I could perform, whether I could endure, whether I could be trusted not to quit when quitting would be easier. That changed me. Not all at once. Not in some movie montage kind of way. Real change is quieter than that. It happens one hard day at a time until you look up and realize the person who arrived is not the person standing here now. There was one morning in particular I still think about. We had finished a brutal conditioning session and I was covered in sweat and dust, my heart slamming in my chest, my legs shaking. One of the drill instructors walked past, stopped and looked at me for half a second. Not warmly. Not kindly. Just directly. "Carter," she said, "you're stronger than you act like." Then she kept walking. That was it. 7 words. No smile, no praise, no comfort. But I carried those words for weeks. Because back home, strength in me had always been treated like defiance, like something to be corrected, softened, brought back into line. At boot camp, strength was not a flaw. It was raw material. Something to build with. By the time graduation approached, I was still tired, still imperfect, still learning. But I was no longer uncertain about why I had come. I had earned my place there. Not through anger at my parents, not through rebellion for its own sake. Through work, through discipline, through the private decision made over and over again not to surrender the life I knew I was meant to live. Graduation day should have felt purely joyful. In some ways it did. The band, the flags, the pride in seeing our platoon move with a unity we had once lacked completely. Families sat in the stands, waving, crying, calling out names when the rules allowed it. Around me, women scanned the crowd for their mothers, fathers, husbands, brothers. I scanned too, even though I knew better. My mother had written twice during boot camp, careful little letters full of weather updates, church news, and cautious encouragement. My father had written nothing. And when the ceremony ended and families gathered in emotional knots all around the parade deck, no one came toward me. I stood there in uniform, chin up, shoulders back, a United States Marine. And I was alone. That moment hurt more than anything a drill instructor had ever said. Not because I doubted myself. Because I no longer did. It hurt because I understood, maybe for the first time, that sometimes becoming who you are costs you the people who were most invested in keeping you the same. Still, I made a choice right there on that parade deck. I would go home first. Not because I needed permission. Not because I expected applause. But because some part of me still hoped they might look at me, really look at me, and finally see, not a disgrace, not a rebellion, not a daughter gone wrong. Just their daughter. Standing strong. Ready to come home. By the time the plane touched down in Dayton, I had been awake for almost 20 hours. Travel after boot camp felt strange. During training, every movement had purpose. Every minute belonged to someone else. Then suddenly I was in an airport with people eating cinnamon rolls at 10 in the morning, children dragging stuffed animals through security lines, older couples in matching windbreakers, arguing gently over boarding passes. Ordinary American life was happening all around me, calm and messy and familiar, and I felt like I was seeing it through glass. I had imagined coming home more times than I could count. Not in some grand, unrealistic way. I didn't picture my father crying or my mother hanging a banner over the garage. I knew my family too well for that. But I had allowed myself to hope for something simple. Maybe a quiet nod from my dad. Maybe my mom making pot roast because she knew it was my favorite. Maybe awkwardness, yes, but also relief, a beginning. The closer I got to home, the more that hope lifted in me like something fragile but stubborn. I rented a small car and drove north through the flat gray-brown fields of early spring. Ohio after winter always looks like it is waiting for permission to wake up. The trees were bare, the ditches still muddy, and the sky sat low and colorless over everything. It should have felt bleak. Instead, it felt like home. I passed the gas station where I used to buy coffee before community college classes, the diner where my mother liked the chicken salad plate, the high school football field, where half the town still gathered on Friday nights every fall, as if time had politely stopped there. All of it was so familiar that it made my chest ache. When I turned onto our street, I slowed down. Mrs. Hanley from next door was out on her porch, sweeping winter grit from the boards. She looked up, squinted, and then lifted a hand. Her mouth opened in surprise when she saw me in uniform, but I only gave a small wave and kept driving. I wasn't ready for anyone else's reaction until I knew my parents. The house looked exactly the same. White siding still overdue for paint. Blue shutters slightly crooked. My father's old pickup in the driveway. For a second I smiled. The truck being there meant he was home. It meant I wouldn't have to wonder whether he'd avoided me. I parked, grabbed my duffel, and walked up the front steps. No one opened the door. No footsteps hurried down the hallway. I let myself in. The stillness hit me first. Not peaceful stillness, empty stillness. The kind that makes every small sound feel too loud. Mom, nothing. Dad, nothing again. My duffel slid from my shoulder onto the floor. I noticed little things automatically the way people do when they've been away and are measuring change without meaning to. The basket of mail on the hall table was fuller than usual. My mother's cardigan was draped over the banister. My father's work boots sat by the back door, mud dried along the sides. So they had been home. Or had meant to be. The kitchen light was on. I walked toward it with that hope still alive inside me, though smaller now. Maybe they had stepped out. Maybe there was dinner in the oven. Maybe there would be one uncomfortable human conversation that could start setting things right. Then I saw the note taped to the refrigerator. Yellow legal paper. My father's handwriting. I knew what it said before I was close enough to read it. I don't know how to explain that except to say that when you grow up with someone's anger, you learn the shape of it from a distance. I moved closer anyway. And read the words. You're a disgrace to this family. Pack and don't come back. There are moments in life when your body understands something before your mind does. My stomach turned cold. My face flushed hot. My hands went still. For several seconds I just stood there looking at the note while the refrigerator hummed under it, patient and indifferent. I wish I could tell you I cried. A younger version of me might have. But boot camp had taught me to meet pain without immediately collapsing under it. Not because I was hard-hearted, because sometimes staying upright is the only dignity left to you. So I stayed upright. I read the note again slower. You're a disgrace to this family. That line was my father speaking from the deepest part of himself, the part that feared the judgment of neighbors more than the quiet suffering of people under his own roof. In our town, family was reputation. Reputation was survival. He had spent his whole life believing that respectability could protect you from shame, poverty, uncertainty, maybe even grief. And now his daughter had enlisted in the Marines against his wishes, in full view of everyone. To him, I hadn't just disobeyed. I had exposed him. Pack and don't come back. That line hurt for a different reason. Because my mother had let it stay on that refrigerator. Whether she agreed with it or not, she had not taken it down. I leaned one hand against the counter and looked around the kitchen. The dish towel on the oven handle. The ceramic rooster cookie jar my mother had kept since before I was born. The little stain on the wallpaper near the light switch where a tea kettle had once boiled over. So much ordinary life in that room. So many years. And somehow all of it had narrowed down to one sheet of paper telling me I no longer belonged there. I don't know how long I stood there before I noticed the pen. It was lying beside the phone base on the counter. My father's pen, the heavy blue one he used for bills and insurance forms and every other serious thing. He liked pens that left a hard line on the page. I picked it up. Part of me wanted to crumple the note and toss it in the trash. Part of me wanted to march out, find them wherever they were, and demand they say those words to my face. But another part of me, the stronger, steadier part the Marines had helped shape, understood something important in that moment. Real revenge doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like leaving people alone with the consequences of what they chose. I peeled the tape loose, careful not to tear the page. Turned it over. The back was blank. My hand trembled once, then steadied. I thought about everything I might say. I thought about writing, "I'm still your daughter." I thought about writing, "One day you'll regret this." I thought about writing, "You were wrong about me." All of those would have been true. None of them were what I wrote. Because in that moment I didn't want to beg to be understood. I wanted to tell the truth as plainly as possible. 2 words. That was all. I wrote them slowly, pressing hard enough to leave the impression through the paper. I enlisted. Not I enlisted anyway. Not I enlisted without you. Not I enlisted and I'm sorry. Just the truth. A fact they could not argue with. A decision already made. A life already underway. Those 2 words meant more than joining the Marines. They meant I chose my path. I did not ask permission. I am not waiting for your blessing to become who I am. I taped the note back onto the refrigerator exactly where I had found it. Then I went upstairs. My bedroom looked smaller than I remembered. The quilt my grandmother had made still lay folded at the foot of the bed. A few framed pictures were turned face down on the dresser. My closet door stood open. For one terrible second I wondered if they had already packed my things for me. But they hadn't, not yet. So I packed for myself. Jeans, sweaters, the photo of my late grandfather in his Korean War uniform, my high school yearbook, the Bible my grandmother had given me when I turned 16. I moved carefully not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was. Hurt makes some people sloppy. It makes others precise. I was precise. When I zipped the duffel shut, I looked around the room one last time. So many versions of me had lived there. Child, teenager, dutiful daughter, restless young woman counting the miles to elsewhere. I felt grief, yes. But beneath the grief, there was something else too. Certainty. I carried the bag downstairs, set the house key on the kitchen table, and stood for a moment facing the refrigerator. The note hung there, my father's words on one side, mine on the other. A whole war between generations folded into one piece of paper. Then I walked out. I did not slam the door. I did not leave a message. I got in my car, drove to a motel off the interstate, and paid cash for a room that smelled faintly of bleach and old heat. I sat on the edge of the bed in my uniform and waited for the shaking to start. It never really did. Instead, hours later, my phone lit up. Home. I let it ring. Then again. Home. And again. By the time the calls began to pile up, I understood that my parents had finally come back, seen the note, turned it over, and read the 2 words I had written. And for the first time in my life, they were the ones left standing in the kitchen with no control over what happened next. For the first few weeks after I left that house, the calls came almost every day. At first they were short. Just 1 ring. Sometimes 2. My phone would light up on the nightstand in whatever temporary room the Marines had assigned me, the screen glowing quietly in the dark with a single word. Home. I never answered. Not because I hated them. Not because I wanted them to suffer. But because I knew something they hadn't learned yet. Some silences are necessary. When people have spent years refusing to listen, sometimes the only language left is absence. Life on base moved forward the way military life always does, steady, structured, and largely indifferent to whatever storms were happening in your personal world. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate about it. The Marines didn't ask what your father thought of your career choices. They didn't care whether your neighbors approved. They cared whether you showed up ready, whether you did your job, whether the person next to you could trust you when things got hard. And things did get hard. About 3 months after I left Ohio, our unit received orders for a humanitarian deployment to Central America. A massive storm system had stalled over the region and caused catastrophic flooding across several rural areas. Roads had washed away. Homes had collapsed. Entire communities had been cut off. The mission wasn't combat. It was rescue, relief, recovery. The kind of work that rarely makes headlines but changes lives just the same. We landed on a humid morning that smelled like mud and diesel fuel. Helicopters thumped overhead in steady rotations, ferrying supplies and personnel between makeshift landing zones, carved out of school fields and damaged roads. Everywhere you looked, there were people working, local volunteers, aid workers, Marines, engineers, everyone trying to push back against the chaos the storm had left behind. Within hours, my boots were coated in red clay. Within a day, my uniform smelled permanently of river water and sweat. And within 2 days, I had seen more devastation than most people in my hometown would ever imagine. Houses broken open like toy boxes. Cars stacked against bridges by the current. Families standing beside what used to be their kitchens or bedrooms or living rooms, holding whatever pieces of their lives they had managed to carry out before the water rose. One afternoon, our team was assigned to help evacuate residents from a flooded neighborhood outside a small town near the mountains. The river had overflowed overnight, and several streets were now waist-deep in water. The current wasn't strong enough to sweep you away, but it carried debris, branches, broken fencing, chunks of roofing that could knock a person off balance if they weren't careful. We moved slowly, checking houses one by one. "Marines," someone shouted from a porch as we approached. "Over here!" A woman stood at the top of 3 concrete steps holding a baby wrapped in a towel. Behind her, 2 older children clung to the doorway, their eyes wide. "Water's still rising," one of the sergeants said quietly. We waded up to the porch. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its tiny face was flushed from the heat, and its cries were thin and exhausted. The woman kept apologizing in broken English, as if the flood had somehow been her fault. "You're okay," I told her. "We've got you." "One of the Marines took the older kids." I took the baby. It felt impossibly small in my arms. Light. Fragile. Trusting. As we moved through the water toward the waiting transport truck, the child's cries softened into little hiccuping breaths. I remember thinking how strange it was that the same hands that had spent months learning to fire a rifle were now holding someone's entire world in the crook of an elbow. War teaches strength, but service teaches something else. Responsibility. Over the next several days, the work continued without pause. We distributed food, helped clear debris, carried elderly residents from damaged homes, and built temporary shelters out of whatever materials were available. It was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply meaningful in a way that's hard to describe unless you've stood in the middle of disaster and watched strangers refuse to abandon one another. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a local journalist began documenting the relief efforts. I didn't notice him at first. Most of us didn't. We were too busy. But on the third day, while we were loading supplies into a truck, he approached one of our officers and asked a few questions. Cameras clicked, notes were taken, the usual process. Later that afternoon, as we carried another group of residents to safety, he snapped a photograph. I didn't see the flash. I didn't hear the shutter. All I knew was that there was a baby in my arms and people who needed help. A week later, back in Ohio, that photograph appeared on the front page of the Dayton Herald. The headline read, "Local Marine Helps Rescue Flood Victims Overseas." The image showed a young woman in a mud-streaked Marine uniform stepping through knee-deep water, a baby wrapped in a towel against her chest, 2 children gripping her free hand. That young woman was me. In my hometown, the paper still landed on front porches before sunrise. My father had always read it with his morning coffee. I imagine that morning started like any other. The kettle whistling. The smell of toast. The newspaper folded beside his mug. Maybe he flipped through the sports section first. Maybe he glanced at the weather. Maybe he wasn't paying much attention until he turned the page and suddenly saw a face he recognized more than he ever expected to again. His daughter. The daughter he had called a disgrace. Carrying a child through floodwater in a Marine uniform. The article mentioned my name. Mentioned the town. Mentioned the mission. Neighbors began calling the house. Church friends stopped my mother at the grocery store. People said things like, "You must be proud." I don't know what my father said in response. But I do know what happened next. Because that was the day the calls started changing. They weren't just once or twice anymore. They came morning and night. They came again and again. My phone would buzz on the metal desk in my barracks room, lighting up the quiet space with the same word every time. Home. At first there were 5 missed calls. Then 10. Then 20. By the time I finally looked at the screen one evening after a long day on base, there were 52 missed calls. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, I began to wonder if the 2 words I had written on the back of that note had finally done something my parents never expected. They had forced my father to see his daughter. Not as a rebellion, not as a disgrace, but as someone he no longer understood and might have been terribly wrong about. For a long time I let the phone ring. Not out of cruelty, not even out of pride, mostly out of caution. There are moments in life when one conversation can either begin healing or reopen wounds that have barely started to close. And I knew my family well enough to understand that my father was not a man who apologized easily. The Marines had taught me patience. They had also taught me timing. So I waited. The missed calls continued to grow. Sometimes they came early in the morning, sometimes late at night. Once during a long training exercise, I returned to my locker and found 12 new missed calls in a single afternoon. Always the same number. Home. I imagined my mother pacing the kitchen with the cordless phone in her hand, glancing toward the refrigerator every time it rang. I imagined my father sitting at the table pretending not to listen while she dialed again. But imagination only goes so far. Eventually, reality catches up. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening. I had just returned to my barracks after a long day of field training. The base had that calm feeling it sometimes gets at the end of the weekend, less noise, fewer trucks moving around, the distant hum of evening routines settling in. I tossed my cap on the desk and reached for my phone. The screen lit up. Home. It was ringing again. For a moment I just stared at it. I could have let it go to voicemail like the others. But something inside me, something steady and calm, told me this time was different. So I answered. Hello? The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then I heard breathing. Familiar breathing. And a voice I hadn't heard in months. Emily? It was my father. For a moment neither of us spoke. The strange thing about hearing a parent's voice after a long silence is how quickly it pulls memories back to the surface. In that instant, I heard every version of him at once: the man calling me in for dinner when I was a kid, the voice explaining how to change a tire when I was 16, the angry father at the kitchen table telling me women didn't belong in the Marines. Now he sounded older. Not weak. Just careful. Yes, I said quietly, it's me. Another pause. Then he cleared his throat the way he always did when he didn't know what to say next. Your mother. She's been trying to reach you. I noticed. It wasn't meant as sarcasm. Just the truth. More silence stretched between us. Somewhere in the background I could hear the faint clink of dishes, my mother in the kitchen, probably listening to every word. Finally, my father spoke again. We saw the article. I knew exactly which one he meant. The newspaper. Yes. He exhaled slowly. They had your picture. I waited. He continued. You were carrying a baby. Yes. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice sounded different. Less certain. I didn't know you were doing that kind of work. The sentence carried more meaning than the words themselves. My father had always imagined the Marines as chaos and violence, guns shouting war movies on television. To him, my enlistment had been a rejection of everything he believed daughters should be. But the newspaper photo had shown him something else. Service. Responsibility. Humanity. We help where we're needed, I said. He was quiet again. Then he said something I had never heard him say in my entire life. I was wrong. The words landed softly but heavily at the same time. My father was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. In my childhood, disagreements usually ended with silence rather than apology. But now those 3 words hung between us. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but the door to it. I thought he began, then stopped. What I asked gently. I thought you were throwing your life away. His voice cracked slightly. I thought the Marines would take you somewhere dangerous and break you. I leaned back against the wall beside my desk. They did take me somewhere dangerous, I said. Another pause. But they didn't break me. I could hear my mother whispering something in the background. My father lowered his voice. Your mother wants to talk to you. Before I could respond, the phone rustled as it changed hands. Then I heard her. Oh, Emily. Just those 2 words. And then she started crying. Not loud crying. Quiet crying. The kind that carries months of regret inside it. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have stopped him. I should have taken that note down. I closed my eyes. Hearing her say it made the memory of that kitchen feel suddenly closer. You were always strong, she continued. I just didn't understand what that strength meant. It's okay, I said softly. No, she said, it wasn't. There was a long moment where neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me. The whole town has been talking about you. That must be strange, I said. For your father especially. In the background, I heard him mutter something that sounded like, I can hear you, Linda. For the first time in the conversation, I smiled. Then my mother said quietly, your dad hung that newspaper clipping on the wall. That caught my attention. Where? In the kitchen. Right beside the refrigerator. The same place where the note had been. I imagined the scene. The yellow legal paper gone. The photograph in its place. Mud on my boots. A baby in my arms. A daughter my parents were finally beginning to see. Emily, my father's voice returned to the phone. Yes. He took a breath. You don't have to answer now, but... His voice softened in a way I had never heard before. Would you ever consider coming home for a visit? The question sat quietly between us. Months earlier, that house had rejected me. Now the door was opening again. I looked out the small window of the barracks room. The sky was turning deep blue as evening settled across the base. Maybe I said, and for the first time since the night I walked away from the kitchen, home didn't feel like a closed door anymore. A year passed before I walked back into that kitchen. Life in the Marines has a way of measuring time differently than the civilian world. Months go by in training rotations, deployments, field exercises, and assignments. Holidays sometimes arrive quietly in the middle of a work schedule. Birthdays come and go with little ceremony. But some dates stay with you. The day you enlist. The day you graduate. The day a phone call changes everything. And the day you decide it might be time to go home. My leave request had been approved in early October. Autumn was already settling across Ohio by the time my plane landed again in Dayton. The trees were turning gold and red along the highway, and the air carried that crisp smell that always reminds people of football games and apple orchards. As I drove the rental car toward my hometown, I noticed something strange. I wasn't nervous. A year earlier, that same road had felt heavy with uncertainty. I had been carrying hope, fear, anger, and heartbreak all tangled together. Now there was only calm. Not because everything had been fixed, but because time had softened the sharpest edges. My parents and I had spoken several times since that first phone call. None of the conversations were dramatic. There were no speeches, no sudden miracles, just small talks that gradually grew longer. My mother asked about the base. My father asked careful questions about my work. Neither of them tried to pretend the past hadn't happened. And neither did I. Healing, I've learned, rarely comes all at once. It comes in small, honest moments. When I turned onto our street again, the neighborhood looked almost exactly as it always had. Mrs. Hanley's porch was decorated with pumpkins now. A group of kids rode bicycles down the sidewalk, their laughter carrying through the cool air. My father's pickup truck was still in the driveway. Some things don't change. I parked at the curb and sat there for a moment looking at the house. The paint still needed work. The shutters were still crooked. But the place didn't feel hostile anymore. Just familiar. I stepped out of the car and walked up the front steps. This time, before I even reached the door, it opened. My mother stood there. For a second, we just looked at each other. Then she wrapped her arms around me. "Oh, Emily." She held on tightly the way people do when they've been afraid something might never come back. I hugged her back just as firmly. "You're thinner," she said, stepping back and studying my face. "You're the one who used to feed me," I said with a smile. She laughed softly through her tears. "Come inside." The house smelled exactly the same. Coffee, old wood, and something warm cooking in the oven. I stepped into the kitchen. My father stood beside the table. For a moment he looked unsure of what to do with his hands. Then he did something that would have shocked the younger version of me. He stepped forward and hugged me. My father had never been a man who hugged much, but this time the gesture was quiet and sincere. "It's good to see you," he said. "You too, Dad." We pulled apart awkwardly but warmly. Then my eyes moved toward the refrigerator. The place where the note had once hung. The yellow paper was gone. In its place was a framed newspaper clipping. The photo showed a Marine in muddy boots carrying a baby through floodwater. I walked closer and studied it. "You framed it," I said. My father cleared his throat. "Well, seemed like it deserved a place in the kitchen." I ran my fingers along the frame. "That note isn't here anymore," I said quietly. "No," he replied. He hesitated. "I took it down the same day we saw the article." My mother set 3 coffee mugs on the table. "We should have taken it down sooner." No one argued with that. We sat together at the kitchen table. For the first time in a long while, we talked like a family. Not perfectly, but honestly. My father admitted something he had never said before. I was afraid of what I asked. That the world would chew you up. He looked down at his hands. And that people would think I'd failed as a father. I nodded slowly. I was afraid too. Of what? That if I stayed here, I'd never become who I was supposed to be. The 3 of us sat quietly for a moment. Then my father said something that surprised me. "You know, the Marines didn't take our daughter away." He glanced at the newspaper clipping. "They helped her become someone we should have been proud of all along." My mother squeezed my hand. And in that small kitchen in Ohio, something that had been broken finally began to mend. Years have passed since that day. I'm older now. My parents are older too. We still disagree sometimes, families always do, but we've learned something important along the way. Pride can build walls faster than love can climb them. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can say isn't a command or an argument. Sometimes it's simply, I was wrong. If you're listening to this story tonight, and it reminds you of someone in your own life, a son, a daughter, a parent you haven't spoken to in years, maybe it's worth remembering something. Time moves faster than we expect. Phone calls go unanswered. Words get left on refrigerators. But it's never too late to choose understanding over pride. And if this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Stories like this remind us that families don't have to be perfect to find their way back to each other. Sometimes all it takes is one honest conversation. And maybe the courage to pick up the phone.